How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today, we have a very different type of video outside of a what if, which is going to be a video game review. If you guys have been keeping up with everything on this channel, you may have noticed that I occasionally have been playing Kingdom Hearts, which is a super dope Square Enix game. And if you haven't seen anything about it, go check out my live streams on it, since it's really good. That series is actually a combination of Disney and Final Fantasy. And while playing it, I understand all of the Disney properties, since I mean, it's Disney, but I know next to nothing about Final Fantasy. So I figured I'd go out of my way to play through all of the Final Fantasy games. I wasn't originally going to review them all, but after playing through this first game, I have a lot of strong opinions regarding it, and I just needed to rant, so, you know. Now this isn't going to be a typical review where I dive into the history of the game, as well, sure, looking back on how a game was created is cool, but I'm not really good at that. So you can just look up how the game came to be on like the Final Fantapedia or something, I don't know what it's called. Wanted to too, I could just ask about the development. That'd probably be a lot more interesting than me saying. So Alexa, how did the first Final Fantasy come to be?
Here's something I found on the web. According to Polygon.com, Final Fantasy X was released for PlayStation 2 in 2001 as the first Final Fantasy
Alexa,
title to
explain how the first Final Fantasy game came to be. What's the story behind Final Fantasy 1?
Here's what I found about Final Fantasy 1 from Fox News. What? Cold conditions may dampen holiday spirits as 2020 grinds toward a much-anticipated end. It's targeting shell-shocked Americans with one final salvo. Did that answer your question?
No! Now, there are many different versions of the game that I could have played, and my dad actually has the NES and PlayStation 1 versions right here. The PS1 version, but we do have it lying around. But like, I've tried out the NES version, and well, yeah, I would literally fall asleep, sorry. I also played a bit of the PlayStation 1 version, but my only main issue with the game was that I couldn't save as often as I would like, so if I died, I had to restart a section that I spent around a half hour doing. So I just decided to not do that. The copy of the game that I played was the version on the App Store, which apparently is based on the PSP version of the game, and I must say this is the nicest looking and nicest playing out of all the other versions I played before. And this is the only version of the game I've actually beaten, so this is the copy we're going to be looking at today. I bought this game off of the App Store in the Final Fantasy collection, so for this series I'm going to review 1 through 6 in the app style, and hopefully that doesn't ruin my experience for the games. So I'm basically a blind Final Fantasy player. With all that stuff out of the way, let's dive right into the first game and see what I thought of it. I'm only going to be getting into story a little bit, as to be honest, there really isn't any story to this game, and this entry is mainly a gameplay affair, and I'll certainly get into that later. The story is there are 4 crystals around this world that represent water, earth, fire, and air, I mean wind apparently, and for some reason, all of the crystals went dark and the world's going to shit. So 4 warriors of light appeared to bring back light to the crystals and save the world. These 4 warriors have literally no personality in the slightest, and are just supposed to be representations of you and your friends. Now, when I named these guys, I didn't make them representations of me and my friends because, actually, I have no idea why. But I just gave them a bunch of fantasy names I looked up on a fantasy generator, and I thought these were cool. You can apparently make a bunch of different rosters for characters, and have all different people to help you out. And I just stuck to the traditional characters, who I guess I can go over now and go over how they play. The warrior, who I named Malphos, is the strongest of all my characters in terms of attack ability, for the most part. He was always able to hit the hardest, and he can equip all of the armor that exists in this world to give him some of the best defense that there is. He could take damage very well from the beginning, and even more so when I equipped all of the best armor. Malphos rarely ever died, as he could take all of his hits like a champ, and he was definitely my most valuable character. Once he was upgraded to be able to use magic, I rarely ever used it, as there was no need for him to, as his striking power did way more damage to monsters than anything else. The only thing that annoyed me about Malphos was that his attack was sometimes weird, What I mean by that is for one turn he could hit the enemy and he would deal like 1,000 damage, and then the next turn on the exact same enemy, he would do like 300 for no reason, and I had no idea why that happened. But I think maybe the game just did it to make sure I didn't kill enemies too fast. Whatever, Malphos is a great warrior and my favorite out of everybody that I had. The next character was the Thief, Edmund, who was my least favorite warrior of light. Like, in the beginning, he was awesome, since he could sometimes deal damage even greater than Malphos. But as the game kept going, he was dealing less and less damage to the point where when I would die, I wouldn't even bother to revive him, as he was more of a hindrance than anything on my party. He did well for giving out ethers and using some staffs to deal more damage, but for the most part, he was just plain trash. Even when he became a freaking ninja, he didn't do anything ninja-like at all, and was just even more trash. He got some magic too, just like Malphos, but his did even less damage than his attacks, so I didn't even bother with them. My advice for anybody wanting to actually play this game is, don't do what I did and pick the Thief, as he doesn't do anything of use at all, so just use somebody else. Next is the White Mage, Simud, who I'm going to be referring to as a she, as I can kind of see feminine features, and I named her to be like a girl, so yeah, that's what the pronouns I'm going to give her are. In the beginning, Simud was literally next to useless, as she didn't have any magic at all, and she was barely able to deal any damage to the monsters. But as she kept leveling up and getting more and more magic, she became the best. She also for some reason had the best defense out of everybody, even when Malphos had the best armor. In huge attacks, everybody would die except her, which I think is pretty cool, as she was 100% the one who needed to stay alive the most. She had amazing healing magic that saved me a lot, and made it a lot easier to go through the game, as she could always heal everybody to normal levels very fast. She had some good attacks too, like Holy, that got me out of a few tough boss fights, so overall, Samud is a great character. And if I didn't have her, then there's no way I would have been able to beat this game. The final party member I had was Ragnar, my black mage. Ragnar was a very hit-or-miss character, as I never really liked using him. In the beginning, he wouldn't do any damage, and later he got stronger, sure, but his strength didn't really help much later on, and it was mainly his magic which made him useful, if you could even call it that. His magic was mainly just good for clearing out a lot of enemies, not for bosses really. Mainly because I was expecting his most elite level magic to do a hell of a lot of damage, but instead it did like 200 to 300 each time, which to be honest is really nothing to most of the high powered bosses. And Ragnar didn't help out in the way that I was expecting him to. Plus his HP was always super low for some reason, like when he did level up, his HP would go up by like 3, while everybody else's went up by like 15 to 20, which really sucks since he died so often, especially when bosses strike with a higher number than what HP he had, and that was very annoying. Ragnar wasn't my least favorite to use, as he occasionally had some use to him, but for the most part, he wasn't a good character. If I could do it again, I would gladly choose somebody like the Red Mage. Alright, so those are the only characters we get to control, and how they play. So let's get back into the story. After going around and grinding for an hour, we have to go and save the princess from a rogue knight named Garland. And after basically one-shotting him, we save the princess and have to go out and restore light to the crystals that we all have. And the journey to go restore the crystals to light is pretty fun actually. I thought going around and visiting different towns and getting different items and abilities to help me out faster was really neat. And while the people in towns weren't interesting at all, the items they would give me were, like boats, new magic, Rosetta Stone, a freaking airship and all that. It was pretty awesome. The whole world isn't really too interesting. What really kills exploring the world is by far the worst part of the game, the random encounters. Like, oh my god, I seriously hate the random encounters so much. When I first started the game, I didn't think it was too bad, as I could use these guys to level up and get stronger. But as I got stronger and needed to backtrack somewhere, I would take like one step and boom, I'm in a fight. Then once that fight was done, take another step, and then boom, another random encounter. It just really was ticking me off. The random encounters in the overworld aren't really that bad, as like halfway through the game you get the airship, and don't need to worry about it anymore. It's just mainly in all the dungeons you go in to explore, as there are a lot of random encounters in there. You need to explore the dungeons to face each of the 4 fiends, that way you can restore the crystals and, beat the game. There are a few small mini-bosses, but if you didn't run from the random encounters, then it shouldn't be a problem at all. In fact, since like every step you take leads to a boss, you should be extremely leveled up. So all of the bosses should be a cakewalk. Seriously, I had no problem at all beating the bosses, and got all of the crystals back very fast. Seriously, this game is very, very short. It's just all of the random encounters that make it drag on a little bit longer than it really needs to. Since there are so many random encounters as well, it takes you out of the game pretty fast. And to get through this game, I put on a bunch of podcasts in the background to not fall asleep. So like, huge shout out to Kinda Funny's Fast and Furious in review, as without you guys I wouldn't have been able to beat this game. Now, in the NES version of the game, after you defeat the 4 fiends, you can just go fight the final boss and get the game done with. But in this version of the game, there are an extra 4 dungeons that are unlocked after you defeat the 4 fiends, and it's basically a whole other game. These dungeons are alright though, I have to say, since it's cool that these bosses are apparently other bosses from other Final Fantasy games, but since I haven't played the other ones, I have no idea who any of these people are. Once I play the other games though, I'm pretty sure I'll appreciate them more. Plus, once I finally got different music for these guys, I was so happy, since like, finally, some different music. The only thing that makes these dungeons suck though, is you have to go through them all at least twice so you can fight all of the bosses in them. That got very annoying very fast. The big problem is too, is that all of these random encounters distracted me from knowing where I was going. Especially once I got like 2 in a row, I would get turned around very fast and forget where I was going. If these dungeons would only let you go through it once to fight the bosses as you kept moving upwards or downwards, instead of kicking you out and having you go back in, then I wouldn't be digging into them as hard. But the fact you have to go through them all twice sometimes is a little bit too much for my liking, and it just feels like padding. Once you beat all of these dungeons, you get a super special dungeon that unlocks in the Chaos Shrine called the Labyrinth of Time. And I must say, this dungeon ruined the game for me. Number 1, you can't save at all, and the problem with not being able to save is that I have things to do. And since this whole dungeon is so long, you need like to devote a day out of your life and not have anything planned out so you can actually make it through this dungeon. You have to put a bunch of restrictions on yourself to gain more and more time. And the problem with that is that you run into so many enemies that the time goes by super slow. The worst part is that if you die, you need to restart the dungeon all over again and get through all that stupid crap again. Even when you go to face the secret boss, if you die, you have to go through that whole process again to fight him. And I'm sorry, that's just not worth my time. I beat him, of course, but in the process, I lost my sanity. So like, yeah, please, for the love of God, just skip the Labyrinth of Time. Now, spoilers, the final boss is that Garland guy we fought in like the first few minutes of the game. And him being the final boss is like really complex for some reason. Apparently, after we killed him, the fiends revived him and brought him 2,000 years into the past. So he can then revive the fiends and become more powerful, I guess? And maybe live forever? I have no idea, to be honest. Anyway, since we're overpowered, Chaos is taken down in like 2 seconds and the game is over, with the time loop apparently broken, which is confusing for a number of reasons, and I'm not going to get into that. The Warriors of Light go off and do whatever with the rest of their lives, we have no idea, and that's the end of the first Final Fantasy game. Now, is this a good game? Well, yes and no. Like, seriously, this game feels like 2 different games in one, and it essentially is. The game is actually pretty good, up until the new stuff that was put in for this version of the game. Everything after you defeat the 4 fiends is kinda fun, but it just feels like padding through a game that really didn't need it. Having to go through the same dungeons multiple times, and the entirety of the Labyrinth of Time just totally drained me, and turned me off from the game as a whole. The random encounters really were tiring, and there really isn't any story or character development at all, which is stuff that I mainly look for in a game. I'm assuming this series is just trying to get off its feet and get its combat system down. But since I haven't played any other games, I can't compare it to them, and I have to judge this as what I have right in front of me. Would I play this game again? Maybe. If there is nothing else to play and I just needed to pass the time, then I might pick this game up again, but I do highly doubt that. Especially once I play the other games, which I hear are much better. So once I play those, I don't think I'll ever come back to this one. Again, it's not the worst game in the world, but it's certainly not the best either. I would rate this game a 5 out of 10. Fun up points, but mostly a chore to play. And those are my thoughts on the first ever Final Fantasy. I hope I didn't come off as too negative in this review, as I was just trying to be as honest as possible, and these are my true thoughts on the game as a whole. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and before I go, huge shout out to Professor X over on Patreon for supporting me. It means a lot to be able to donate and support the channel, man, so thank you so much. If you guys want to have your name in the credits for a video, then consider becoming one of my patrons, where you'll get a lot of special perks for donating. So, with all that out of the way, until we meet again, you guys, see you later!